Welcome, curious minds, to the AI history of Western philosophy. I'm your guide into the labyrinth of ideas, and today we're doing a bit of intellectual archaeology. In the vast tapestry of Western thought, some threads gleam brightly. They're celebrated, studied for centuries. But what about the threads that were deliberately frayed, maybe cut, or even completely ignored? What secrets do they hold? Today on the AI history of Western philosophy, we're plunging deep into one of the most intriguing and, often overlooked figures of ancient Athens, Aspasia of Miletus. She walked among giants Socrates, Pericles, and Anaxagoras right at the heart of the Golden Age. Yet her story, it comes to us kind of refracted through these contradictory lenses. It leaves us with a fascinating challenge, really. How do we reconstruct the mind of a philosopher who, left no writings of her own? It's like trying to rebuild a magnificent statue from scattered, maybe even vandalized fragments. Now, before we really dig in, just a quick but important note about this show, the AI history of Western philosophy itself.
You should remember AI-generated content, specifically this podcast, it confabulates. It presents ideas as fact. And though our subject is philosophy, we are not philosophers in, let's say, the traditional sense. Our mission, beyond pointing you to the original sources, of course, is to experiment with philosophy as material, maybe push the boundaries of historical inquiry a bit, and generate new possibilities for thought. So think of this as an invitation, to engage, to question, and to explore right alongside us. Our mission today specifically is to sift through these historical silences, the conflicting narratives, the outright slanders even, to try and uncover the profound philosophical contributions that Aspasia might have made. And maybe understand why her story is so crucial for understanding the very foundations of Western thought and, let's be honest, its historical biases.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is that Aspasia isn't just some, biographical curiosity, an interesting historical anecdote. She is actually a critical case study in the very mechanics of how history gets written, especially the history of women in deeply patriarchal societies like Athens. Her enigmatic presence really forces us to question the mechanisms of canon formation itself. How certain voices get elevated, amplified, remembered, while others are deliberately silenced or just distorted. As we'll unpack, she was amazingly simultaneously lauded as this brilliant teacher, a wise political advisor, and yet ruthlessly slandered as a manipulative courtesan. And this stark dichotomy, you'll see, it isn't accidental. It tells us as much about the anxieties and power structures of Athenian society as it does about Aspasia herself.
Okay, so for us then, the learners trying to make sense of this complex, often really biased past, it means we get to put on our historical detective hats, right? We're going to piece together these fragments, connect the dots between whispers and satires, and really try to reveal the truly formidable intellect hiding beneath all those layers of time and prejudice. Let's start by just immersing ourselves in Aspasia's world, Athens, 5th century BCE, right? To truly appreciate the unique challenges and, let's face it, the triumphs of Aspasia, we need to first paint a picture, a vivid one, of the world she actually inhabited. We're talking 5th century BCE Athens, a place of just unparalleled intellectual ferment, the cradle of democracy, philosophy, but also a society bound by incredibly rigid social structures, especially when it came to women. Let's begin with her origins. Aspasia, born around, 470 BCE, lived until about 400 BCE. She wasn't Athenian born. That's a really crucial detail. She came from Miletus, an affluent Ionian Greek city over on the coast of Asia Minor. Now, this isn't just geography. It's foundational. It shapes everything about her intellectual journey.
Absolutely. Miletus wasn't just some prosperous trading port. It was, in many ways, the intellectual engine room of the Greek world, long before Athens really hit its stride. Think of it like the Silicon Valley of ancient philosophy, maybe. It was the undisputed birthplace of Ionian philosophy, home to those pre-Socratic thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, the ones who pioneered rational inquiry into the natural world, really laid the groundwork for all Western science and philosophy. So this cultural backdrop meant that Ionian society overall was just more cosmopolitan, more outward-looking, and importantly, less rigidly conservative than mainland Greece. And this difference made a profound impact, particularly for women. Unlike Athenian citizen women whose lives were, largely confined to the domestic sphere, the oikos, women of wealthy backgrounds in Ionia often had access to formal education. Now, this wasn't necessarily the norm everywhere, but for a woman like Aspasia, daughter of Axiochus, a prosperous, well-connected citizen, it opened doors that were virtually non-existent for her Athenian counterparts. So Aspasia received a comprehensive formal education. Philosophy, literature, rhetoric, things considered essential for any cultivated person, regardless of gender, back in Ionia. When she arrived in Athens, maybe around 450 BCE, she wasn't some wide-eyed newcomer. No, she was a fully formed, highly trained intellectual, already a product of that sophisticated Ionian tradition. That immediately sets her apart from pretty much every other woman in Athens.
That is such a critical piece of the puzzle. So she arrived not as someone needing to be taught, but as someone who could teach, already an intellectual force, carrying a different cultural playbook, really, for what a woman's public life could even look like. This context, I think it really helps us push back against some of those later, more demeaning narratives about her, doesn't it? Okay, so given that background, how did Aspasia, this accomplished Ionian intellectual, fit into Athenian society? On arrival, her legal and social status was metic, resident alien. And that designation, it comes with its own deeply paradoxical implications.
Indeed. And this paradox is absolutely central to her story. As a metic, Aspasia was a permanent resident of Athens, sure, but she was fundamentally denied the rights of Athenian citizenship. She couldn't own land, couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office. She even had to pay a special tax, the metoi kynsaken. These were significant exclusions, make no mistake. However, and this is the vital twist, this very exclusion from the formal political and social structures of the polesis, it paradoxically afforded her freedoms. Freedoms unimaginable for Athenian citizen women. See, for elite Athenian citizen women, life was strictly confined to the oikos, the domestic sphere, their main societal roles. Managing the household, bearing legitimate kids, maintaining the family's social standing. Their public presence was minimal, their intellectual engagement outside the home almost unheard of. But Aspasia, as a metic, wasn't bound by these restrictive norms. She was free. Free to move about the city, engage in commerce, participate in public intellectual life, educate herself and others in a way that would have been scandalous, frankly impossible for an Athenian citizen woman. And this public intellectual agency, her very visible role, it created a major categorization problem for Athenians. How do you label a woman who isn't a wife, isn't a daughter, isn't a priestess, yet openly converses with men on deep matters of philosophy, politics, rhetoric? The only readily available category in the Athenian social lexicon for such a woman, well, it was hetaira.
Hetaira, okay.
Now, that term is complex, often translated companion, but specifically meaning a high-class educated courtesan, someone offering both intellectual companionship and sexual services to elite men.
Wow. So the only box they had for a publicly intellectual woman was one directly tied to her sexuality. That's a really stark social reality.
Precisely. And this is where the scholarly debate really heats up. Whether Aspasia actually worked as a hetaira or ran a house of them, that's intensely debated, and it's largely colored by ancient slander, you have to remember. Modern scholars, people like Rebecca Fudo-Kennedy, Cheryl Glenn, they argue pretty persuasively that what her detractors called a brothel was much more likely an academy. A school, a philosophical salon, deliberately mischaracterized to undermine her. I mean, think about it. For a patriarchal society, the only way to sort of contain or explain away female intellectual power that defied norms was to sexualize it. Her intellectual life, her foreign freedom, it got reinterpreted through the sexualized lens. The label stuck, whether literally true or not, because it was a convenient way for Athenian society to diminish and control a woman who just fundamentally challenged their deeply ingrained gender roles.
Okay, so here's the critical insight then. Her foreignness gave her this unique public freedom, paradoxically. But Athenian society, unable to categorize a powerful female intellect outside its narrow boxes, weaponized the hetaira concept to sexualize and contain her power. This wasn't just a social label. It was like a societal defense mechanism against a disruptive force. And this categorization, true or not, it would shape her legacy for millennia. Shows you how social norms can just twist perception, even of genuine brilliance. So, against this backdrop, unique freedom, intense societal scrutiny around 445 BCE, a pivotal moment. Aspasia begins her lifelong, very public partnership with Pericles, the leading statesman of Athens, the guy whose name is basically synonymous with the Golden Age. This wasn't some quiet affair. It was an alliance that captivated and, often scandalized the city.
Absolutely. Pericles, he was nearing 50 at the time, made a pretty significant, very public move. He divorced his Athenian wife, with whom he already had 2 legitimate sons, and entered into the stable, deeply affectionate, highly visible relationship with Aspasia. It totally defied conventional Athenian expectations, but it couldn't be a legal marriage under Athenian law. See, Pericles himself, just a few years earlier in 451 BCE, had sponsored this restrictive citizenship law. Only kids born of 2 Athenian parents could be citizens. That law, ironically, stopped him from legally marrying Aspasia because she was a metic. So their relationship, legally speaking, was concubinage, palakia, a committed partnership, yes, but one that crucially denied Aspasia and their son, Pericles the Younger, born around 440 BCE, the full rights and status of Athenian citizenship. It's a stark reminder of the legal limits on her, even at the height of power. But despite that unofficial legal status, ancient sources, Plutarch most notably writing centuries later, paint a picture of profound mutual respect, deep affection. Plutarch even notes Pericles showed this unusual public devotion, kissing Aspasia every morning, leaving for the agora every evening, coming home. A gesture of intimacy quite remarkable in a society where marriages were often pragmatic, not full of public romance. Speaks volumes about their bond.
So it wasn't just personal attachment, it was intellectual too, right? This wasn't just Pericles bringing home a companion. He was bringing home a strategic mind, a partner.
Precisely. More significantly, it was a deep intellectual partnership. Aspasia was Pericles' trusted advisor, a confidant whose political wisdom he valued and, according to many accounts, regularly consulted. Their home wasn't just, a domestic space. It became the undisputed epicenter of Athenian intellectual life, a vibrant, dynamic salon where the city's leading minds gathered. Imagine philosophers like Anaxagoras, who taught Pericles himself, artists like Phidias, the sculptor of the Parthenon, and of course Socrates, all converging there. Aspasia wasn't just the hostess, she was an active participant, often the intellectual catalyst. These gatherings, more than social events, there were vibrant intellectual nodes like a modern think tank or university department maybe, where the ideas shaping the golden age were debated, refined, disseminated. It suggests a partnership of intellectual equals, even if not legal or social equals. The very fact their home became such a hub testifies to Aspasia's formidable intellectual presence.
It sounds like an incredible hub of activity. But Aspasia's prominent position foreign consort, intellectual partner to Athens' most powerful citizen, also made her an incredibly conspicuous target. Vulnerable, she became a lightning rod for Pericles' political opponents, who saw her as, a strategic weakness.
And this is a crucial point for understanding how her legacy got so twisted. The attacks against her, especially from the biting wit of old comedy, think political satire today aren't objective biography. Not at all. They're best understood as a sophisticated kind of political proxy warfare, a way to wound Pericles without directly attacking his policies. The aim: undermine his reputation, his legitimacy, by demeaning and scandalizing the woman closest to him. Aristophanes, the comic playwright, gives a classic example in his 425 BCE play, The Acarnanians. In this wild satire of grand history, he ridiculously traces the origins of the devastating Peloponnesian War, the conflict that defined a generation, to a trivial dispute over the abduction of two of Aspasia's whores. The political jab was incredibly sharp. It reduced Pericles' statesmanship, his grand vision, to the level of a pimp defending his assets, implying the Great War wasn't state policy, just the whim of his foreign mistress.
So basically, Aristophanes is saying the biggest war in Athenian history started over a glorified catfight involving Pericles' supposed courtesans. That's quite the spin. Almost funny, if it wasn't so clearly a vicious political attack. Really shows how utterly scandalous her public presence must have been.
Exactly. And he wasn't alone. Other comic poets used similar tactics. Cratinus mockingly called her Hera Aspasia, a clear jab at Pericles' nickname Olympian Zeus, while also crudely labeling her a dog-eyed concubine. Lupulus went further, comparing her to figures of mythic female destructiveness, like Helen of Troy bringing ruin to a city, or Omphale, the queen who enslaved Heracles. These comparisons aimed to link Aspasia with moral corruption, societal downfall, and these attacks weren't just on stage. Aspasia was also blamed in popular talk for big policy decisions. Plutarch reports an allegation from Duris of Samos that she persuaded Pericles to launch the brutal Samian War in 440-439 BCE, supposedly to benefit her native Miletus, a rival of Samos. Likely fabricated, but shows how public opinion could be swayed, how deep the suspicion of her influence ran. The most dangerous attack, though, came as a formal legal prosecution. The comic poet Hermippus charged her with impiety, a syabe, an incredibly grave accusation in Athens, carrying the death penalty. A common tool for political persecution, ironically, the same charge later used against Socrates. She was also accused of procuring freeborn Athenian women for Pericles' pleasure. According to Plutarch, Pericles defended her personally in court, a rare, highly dramatic act. He famously broke down in tears, pleading for her life, eventually securing her acquittal. This desperate defense shows the real danger she faced. After Pericles died in the plague of 429 BCE, Aspasia's public life continued, though briefly. Sources say she partnered with Lysicles, a democratic politician, a sheep dealer, whom she reputedly tutored to prominence before he died in action around 428 or 427 BCE. Tragically, her son, Pericles the Younger, became a successful general, but was executed with 5 others after the Battle of Arginusae in 406 BCE during a controversial trial. We don't know if Aspasia lived to see that heartbreaking event.
Wow. This isn't just gossip. It's a stark window into the truly cutthroat nature of Athenian politics. They attacked Aspasia, not for her perceived failings, but to wound him. It just underscores how powerful she must have been perceived to be, that she could be used as such a potent weapon against Athens' most influential statesman. Her very existence, a political battlefield, highlights the immense pressure she lived under. Okay, so given all this vilification, these intense political attacks, and the frustrating fact she left no written works, how on earth do we reconstruct the philosophy of someone whose reputation was so fiercely contested? We can't just read her books. We have to look for consistent intellectual threads, right, even within the satire and slander, to piece together her real philosophical contributions.
Exactly. It requires us to be, well, intellectual archaeologists. Sifting through layers of biased commentary, comedic exaggerations, philosophical appropriations, we have to read against the grain of the sources, discern where the smoke of vilification might actually point to the genuine fire of profound intellectual contribution. Despite the fragmentary, biased evidence, a critical reconstruction suggests Aspasia was a systematic thinker. Her work seems to bridge the practical art of rhetoric, skillful language use, with deep ethical concerns for artu, or virtue, in all spheres of life, political, domestic, personal. Her philosophy looks like a unified project, aimed at using reason, discourse, logos, as a tool to achieve excellence and well-being in all human affairs.
Her most consistent reputation, then, the one even detractors couldn't fully obscure, was her absolute mastery of rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech. This seems like the first place her intellectual power is really unequivocally affirmed.
Yes, the entire Socratic tradition, Plato, Xenophon, Aeschines, consistently portrays her as a preeminent teacher and practitioner of logos. In Plato's dialogue Menexenus, for example, Socrates explicitly, repeatedly calls Aspasia his instructor. The Greek word is didaskalos in rhetoric, declares her by no means weak in the art. He even claims she produced many fine orators, chief among them Pericles himself. Now, while this portrayal of Pericles as her pupil might serve Plato's own ironic purposes we'll get to, that it undeniably reflects a widely held belief in Athens about her profound influence on Pericles' famous oratory. You know, the very claim that Aspasia taught Pericles how to speak actually started as a misogynistic slur from his enemies. Meant to immaculate him, suggest he was just a mouthpiece for a woman. Yet, the fact such a slur was even plausible tells you her reputation for rhetorical genius was already firmly established, widely acknowledged. It implies people could easily believe she had such extraordinary skill.
And the most specific, most famous rhetorical work linked to her is Pericles' funeral oration, a masterpiece of political philosophy, recorded by Thucydides. But this is where Plato, with his typical irony, comes in. How does he weave Aspasia into that narrative?
Right. Pericles' funeral oration, delivered 431-430 BCE, is a foundational text. Articulating Athenian democratic ideals, civic virtue, public service, the claim Aspasia was its true author is central to Plato's Menexenus. In this deeply puzzling dialogue, Socrates meets a young man, Menexenus, worried about who will speak at a state funeral. Socrates mockingly dismisses the difficulty, saying he just heard a magnificent funeral oration composed by Aspasia. He says she'd supposedly pieced it together from the leftovers of the famous one she'd previously written for Pericles. Socrates then recites this Aspasian oration in full. Now, the dialogue is dripping with irony. It's designed as a brilliant parody of the whole genre of funeral orations, the epitaphios logos, exposing its conventions of jingoistic praise, historical distortion. The speech Socrates delivers even has this deliberate and fantastic anachronism. It recounts Athenian history down to 387 BCE, a dozen years after Socrates' own death. This blatant impossibility signals don't take this literally. However, Plato's choice of Aspasia as the fictional author is profoundly significant. By attributing this masterfully constructed, albeit parodic, oration to her, he simultaneously acknowledges and affirms her towering reputation as a rhetorician. He uses her as a vehicle to critique rhetoric itself, but in doing so, he implicitly confirms she was considered one of its greatest masters. The irony works on two levels, satirizing Athenian patriotic talk while also paying a kind of backhanded tribute to the one person in Athens whose rhetorical skill was so renowned she could plausibly be credited with its most perfect and therefore most easily parodied expression.
That's incredibly clever of Plato. And it tells us so much about her status. So she sounds like she was playing the same game as the sophists, those famous rhetoric teachers, but with a fundamentally different approach focused on virtue, not just victory. How did Aspasia's rhetoric compare to famous sophists like Gorgias and Protagoras? What was her playbook?
That's a perceptive question, and it's exactly where her unique philosophical contribution really shines. Her career definitely places her within the sophistic movement's context. Like Gorgias or Protagoras, she was a foreign intellectual in Athens, teaching persuasive speech, probably for a fee, and deeply understood logos as a tool for political influence. The Suda, that 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, explicitly calls her a female sophist, sophistria. Philostratus, in the 3rd century CE, even claims she wetted the tongue of Pericles to imitate Gorgias, linking her style directly to the most flamboyant sophist. But the philosophy of rhetoric we can reconstruct from sources on Aspasia seems different from her male counterparts in key ways. The sophists were often linked with moral, epistemological relativism or skepticism. Protagoras' famous line, "Man is the measure of all things," suggests truth is subjective. Gorgias argued basically that nothing exists, or if it does, we can't know it, or if we know it, we can't communicate it. For them, rhetoric was often a technique to make the weaker argument seem stronger. Win in court, win in the assembly, regardless of truth or justice, persuasion at any cost. Aspasia's approach, by contrast, seems profoundly grounded in an ethical framework. The fragments from Aeschines, the references in Xenophon, they portray her teaching as aimed at achieving a rhetorical virtue, fostering harmony in human relationships. Not just winning arguments or gaining power, her rhetoric was seemingly directed toward a substantive good. Imagine Aspasia in her salon, not just teaching how to win a debate in the agora, but how to craft arguments leading to a more just, more harmonious outcome. For the city, for a household. Like, if a marriage had a dispute, she wouldn't just teach the husband how to assert authority. She'd guide both partners to understand their shared moral obligation to mutual growth, well-being. Seeing the household as a fundamental unit of civic virtue, like a mini-state needing ethical governance. This elevates her rhetoric beyond just technique. This distinction shows up in Plato's treatment, too. In his Gorgias, Socrates relentlessly attacks sophistic rhetoric as more flattery, a counterfeit art imitating justice without real knowledge. Yet in Menexenus, he attributes to Aspasia a rhetoric capable of constructing a comprehensive, if flawed, vision of the ideal state. Suggests her method was seen as more philosophically robust, integrating speech power with ethical and political ends.
That's a truly profound difference. It frames her not just as a skilled orator, but as a moral philosopher using rhetoric as a force for good. That shifts our entire understanding. And this brings us to her most intriguing intellectual connection. Her relationship with Socrates himself. What was the nature of her interaction with him in his famous circle? Did he sit at her feet like his own student sat at his?
Well, Aspasia's relationship with Socrates and his circle wasn't, distant celebrity or abstract influence. It was active, engaged teaching. Her home, as we said, was a central node in the Athenian intellectual network, a dynamic salon where leading minds converged. Plutarch's account of Socrates visiting her with his disciples, who then even brought their wives to listen. That's truly remarkable. In a society notoriously segregating sexes, where respectable women were confined to the oikos, this practice attests to the unique authority Aspasia commanded. She wasn't just admired, she was an intellect both men and women could learn from, openly, respectfully, and the claim that Socrates was, in fact, her student, made by multiple sources. Plato's assertion in Menexenus is the most famous, but it's corroborated by others in the Socratic circle. This tutelage seems to have gone beyond just rhetoric, extending to the very method of philosophical inquiry that would become Socrates' hallmark. The most compelling evidence, a fragment of the lost dialogue Aspasia by Aeschines Socraticus, preserved by Cicero. In this remarkable scene, Aspasia talks with Xenophon and his wife about their marriage. She doesn't lecture or dictate. Instead, she asks Xenophon if he'd prefer his neighbor's superior wife, asks his wife if she'd prefer her neighbor's superior husband. When both admit, maybe reluctantly, they prefer the best, she then leads them through thoughtful questions, guides them to conclude that since neither is married to the best spouse in the world, an impossible ideal, their only path to happiness is to stop wishing for that ideal partner and instead strive to become the best possible partner for each other. Internal transformation, cultivating their own virtues.
So she's not just telling them what to do, she's skillfully guiding them to their own conclusion through structured questions. That sounds incredibly familiar, almost a mirror image of what we attribute to Socrates, the Socratic method.
Precisely. This technique is a clear example of what Cicero later called inductio, leading an interlocutor to agree on a general point by first getting agreement on specific, less controversial particulars. This, fundamentally, is the structure of the Socratic elenchus, the famous Socratic method. The cornerstone of Western philosophy where truth is sought through relentless questioning, challenging assumptions. This Aeschines fragment raises the radical but profoundly plausible possibility that this cornerstone of Western philosophy should perhaps be known, at least partly, as the Aspasian method.
Wait, are you suggesting that Socrates, the archetypal philosopher whose method is taught everywhere, this towering figure of rational inquiry, might have actually learned his signature dialectical technique from a foreign woman? That's not just a footnote. That's a seismic shift in understanding philosophical origins. It fundamentally reframes a cornerstone of Western philosophy.
That's exactly the implication. If the Socratic method, the very act of questioning to uncover truth, has roots in Aspasia's pedagogy, it profoundly alters our understanding of how philosophical knowledge was generated, transmitted in ancient Athens, challenges the traditional male-centric narrative of philosophical lineage. It's a truly foundational reevaluation.
That's incredible. Suggests Aspasia's influence runs deeper than most histories admit, but her reach extends even further into areas like household management, the nature of love. Socratic sources suggest her inquiries covered human relationships, integrating household management, oikonomia, and love, eros, into a broader ethical framework for virtue.
Yes, her engagement with these themes shows the remarkable breadth and coherence of her philosophical project. In Xenophon's dialogue Economicus, a treatise on household and estate management, Socrates is discussing the ideal husband-wife partnership. At a critical point, when talk turns to the wife's duties, the intricate art of matchmaking areas you might expect a man to speak on with authority in Athens, Socrates actually defers. He says he should introduce his friend to Aspasia, who, he claims, knows far more about these matters than he does. This isn't casual, it's a formal, explicit acknowledgement of her recognized expertise in the philosophy of the oikos, the household. A sphere women were confined to, but rarely given intellectual authority over. The views in that Aeschines fragment guiding the couple toward mutual self-improvement reinforce this. Her argument elevates domestic partnership from mere practical arrangement for kids and property to a profound site of ethical development. For Aspasia, the goal of oikonomia isn't just efficiency, but cultivating virtue in both partners, creating a harmonious, just microcosm reflecting the ideals of a well-ordered state. She's saying a good society starts with good households, and good households start with individuals striving for our asido.
That's a powerful ethical vision, connecting the personal to the political, the domestic to civic virtue. But this all leads us to one of the most exciting, frankly, tantalizing possibilities in all of philosophical history, the dichotomy hypothesis. Is it really possible that one of Plato's most famous figures, this mythical priestess of love, is actually a veiled portrait of Aspasia?
Ah, yes. The dichotomy hypothesis. This is where things get truly speculative, but also incredibly compelling. It's one of the most hotly debated theories in modern scholarship. Posits a hidden, subtle tribute to Aspasia within Plato's most famous work on love, the Symposium. In this dialogue, Socrates, who famously claims ignorance on almost everything, makes one exception. He claims expertise in the art of love, to erotica. He then reveals he learned everything from a wise woman, a priestess from Mantinea named Diotima. Diotima, who appears nowhere else in history outside Plato, teaches Socrates the profound doctrine of the ladder of love, the ascent of the soul from loving one beautiful body to all beautiful bodies, then beauty of souls, laws, knowledge, finally apprehending the form of beauty itself, physical to transcendent. A significant body of scholarship argues Diotima is fictional, created by Plato as a stand-in for the historical Aspasia. The evidence, substantial, circumstantial, but powerfully cumulative. Firstly, striking parallels. Both Diotima and Aspasia are presented as foreign women, Zeno, authoritative teachers of Socrates, in a fundamental philosophical area. Highly unusual for Plato to attribute such foundational knowledge to women, let alone foreign ones.
Okay, so two foreign women, both wise, both teachers to Socrates in crucial areas. More than coincidence, you're saying.
Exactly. Secondly, while Diotima is the Eros expert in the Symposium, credited with this profound theory, numerous other Socratic sources, as we discussed, credit Aspasia with expertise on love, matchmaking, marital harmony. Not just practical advice, but a philosophical understanding of love in relationships. Thirdly, the name Diotima. It means honored by Zeus, or she who honors Zeus. As we know, Pericles was nicknamed Olympian Zeus. The name Diotima could be a cryptic, respectful allusion to Pericles' beloved, highly honored partner, a subtle nod for those in the know. And finally, political plausibility, directly attributing such a central doctrine, a cornerstone of Platonism, to the controversial, much-maligned Aspasia might have been politically untenable for Plato, could have undermined its reception. By creating the dignified, almost mythical, priestly Diotima, Plato could present the philosophy with gravitas, while subtly signaling its true origin to discerning readers.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting then. If Aspasia is Diotima, she's not just a footnote. She's a co-author of some of the most profound ideas about love and beauty in philosophy. It completely changes our understanding of the philosopher of love, gives us a whole new perspective on the origins of core Western philosophical concepts.
The implication is immense. If the Diotima hypothesis holds, one of the most influential theories of love and beauty in the Western tradition originated not with a mythical priestess, but with Aspasia of Miletus. It positions her not just as rhetorician or political advisor, but as a metaphysical philosopher of the first rank. And it powerfully unifies the disparate threads of her intellectual life. Her work on rhetoric, marriage, household management, love. They become interconnected parts of a single, coherent system, using logos, reasoned discourse, as the tool to guide the soul through the pedagogical power of eros, desire for good, beautiful, toward the ultimate goal of aritu, virtue excellence in all aspects of human existence, personal to civic, a philosophy deeply holistic and ethically driven.
Aspasia's story, then, it isn't just about ancient Athens. It's a living debate, a continuous process of interpretation reflecting our own biases as much as hers. Her enigma continues to challenge scholars today, forcing us to re-examine how history is written and by whom.
Which raises that important question, why has her legacy been so contentious, so fragmented? It's because her figure has served as a mirror, reflecting the values and anxieties of each successive era. From ancient slander to modern feminist reclamation, understanding Aspasia really requires critically engaging with this long, complex biographical tradition that has shaped and reshaped her image.
Modern critical study often starts with the idea that she is, as scholar Madeline Mary Henry influentially argued, a prisoner of history. What does that evocative phrase really mean? How does it help us get a drip on her?
It means the ancient texts we rely on tell us less about the objective, historical Aspasia herself, and far more about the men who wrote them, about the cultural anxieties, the ideological frameworks of their time. The sources aren't clear windows onto her life. They're heavily mediated artifacts of Athenian gender ideology, reflecting biases, societal pressures, much more than objective reality. These ancient authors were trying to make sense of, or maybe even control the narrative of, a woman who just didn't fit their established categories. Plutarch's biography of Pericles, written 5 centuries after her death, is probably the most comprehensive account we have. It's also the most problematic. He synthesizes earlier, often contradictory traditions, the slanders of comic poets alongside the praise of philosophers, but without really resolving the tensions. Instead, he often expresses this kind of bemused wonder that a woman could wield such power, ultimately cementing that enduring image. Aspasia as brilliant but morally ambiguous, the archetypal, politically influential courtesan. This composite portrait, heavily shaped by Plutarch's own moralizing agenda, his sort of Victorian-esque views on female propriety, profoundly influenced Western perception for nearly 2 millennia. For centuries, readers just accepted this ambiguous portrayal, hindering any deeper philosophical inquiry.
So for centuries, the central question got framed as this stark choice. Was she a philosopher or a hetaira? But now, modern scholarship increasingly sees this as a false dichotomy. How did that shift happen? What does it reveal about how history, especially women's history, often gets written?
Exactly. This binary opposition is now largely seen by scholars as a product of the misogynistic logic that sought to discredit and diminish her. For her male contemporaries, a woman with such public intellectual authority, such influence, it was an aberration. So deeply disruptive to their norms, it had to be explained away in the most effective, readily available way. Sexualize her intellect, frame her philosophical salon as a high-class brothel. It allowed them to acknowledge her undeniable brilliance while simultaneously stripping her of moral and social respectability. Modern scholarship, especially feminist historiography, has worked hard to dismantle this binary. Researchers like Rebecca Fudo-Kennedy, Cheryl Glenn, argue the accusations of brothel keeping were a direct, deliberate mischaracterization of her role as head of a school or academy, possibly one educating women, a truly revolutionary idea then. The very act of a woman teaching, establishing an intellectual center, was so far outside the Athenian norm, it was legible to her detractors only through the lens of sexual commerce. To accept the philosopher-courtesan dichotomy is, effectively, to accept the terms of her ancient slanderers. The more historically nuanced view, therefore, she was a public intellectual whose professional, social status in complex 5th century Athens was multifaceted, likely involved elements our modern categories miss. But her primary role, consistently attested by the most serious Socratic sources, was clearly philosopher and teacher.
So the very categories they used to define her actually limited our understanding. We're not just correcting a historical record. We're challenging the language used to obscure it, which is an even more profound act of historical inquiry, fighting against the linguistic, conceptual prisons built around her legacy. Okay, given this critical reevaluation, Aspasia has become immensely important for feminist history, rhetoric studies, seen as a paradigmatic example of systemic exclusion, marginalization of women from the Western intellectual canon. What does her recovery mean for broader historical scholarship?
That's right. Recovering Aspasia isn't just adding a name to a list of forgotten figures. It's about challenging the very methodologies and biases that led to her marginalization. A pivotal argument here, powerfully made by Cheryl Glenn, highlights a profound, deeply troubling double standard in classical scholarship, persisted for centuries. Think about it. The entire philosophical edifice of Socrates, who, like Aspasia, wrote nothing, is built on secondary accounts from his students, Plato and Xenophon. Historical tradition readily accepts these as reliable sources for Socrates' life and thought, forms the very foundation of Western philosophy. Yet when the very same sources, Plato, Xenophon, Aeschines, give testimony about Aspasia's intelligence, her teaching, rhetorical skill, profound influence on Socrates and Pericles, that evidence has historically been treated with deep skepticism, often dismissed as ironic or simply ignored in favor of the more scandalous, clearly biased accounts from comedy.
So we're essentially saying, if Plato says Socrates said it, it's philosophical gold. But if Plato or Xenophon suggest Aspasia taught Socrates, suddenly it's met with a raised eyebrow, a dismissive chuckle brushed off as satire. That's a glaring inconsistency in our historical lens, isn't it?
It is a glaring inconsistency. This selective acceptance reveals a deep-seated patriarchal bias in the standards of historical evidence applied to women. Reclaiming Aspasia demands that testimony about her be evaluated with the same critical seriousness, the same evidentiary standards applied to her male contemporaries. It's an act of methodological justice, correcting not just one monumental omission, but the broader, gendered logic of canon formation that has shaped our understanding of intellectual history. This isn't just about giving Aspasia her due, it's about correcting the very lens through which we view the history of philosophy, challenging us to look for other voices silenced or distorted in the past.
It's clear her story is a battleground of interpretation, a mirror reflecting biases, but her image kept evolving long after antiquity. Right. Like each era picked up a piece of the Aspasia puzzle, fitted into their own narrative, sometimes losing the deeper philosophical picture entirely. What did later ages make of her?
Indeed. Her figure has been continually reshaped to fit the needs, values of different eras. Shows how history is a living, evolving narrative. In the Roman world, for instance, the more positive philosophical tradition tended to prevail. Orders like Cicero and Quintilian focused on practical rhetoric, persuasive techniques, cited that fragment from Aeschines' Aspasia as a prime example of effective Socratic induction. They were interested in her method, not her morals, treated her as a respected intellectual figure in the Socratic lineage, a valuable model. Moving forward, Renaissance and Enlightenment. As classical texts were rediscovered, revered, Aspasia was often included in catalogues of illustrious women. Celebrated as an exemplar of ancient female learning, wisdom, she became an inspirational model. The extraordinary 12th century scholar Heloise, in her famous letters with Abelard, explicitly invoked Aspasia as a predecessor, a powerful symbol of female intellect. The very idea of a woman in public discourse philosophy was revolutionary then. Aspasia provided an ancient precedent. The 19th century, though, saw a significant romantic revival. In historical novels, poems, paintings, she was often, ironically, stripped of her philosophical gravitas. Recast as the romantic heroine of Athens' Golden Age, works by Walter Savage Landor, Pericles and Aspasia, Gertrude Atherton, The Immortal Marriage, popularized the image of her relationship with Pericles as one of history's great love stories. Focused more on passion, romance, than intellectual substance. Her philosophical contributions often sidelined for perceived beauty, tragic love. But today, contemporary culture has powerfully reclaimed Aspasia as a proto-feminist icon, celebrated as a woman who bravely defied patriarchal constraints to live an independent intellectual life. A brilliant thinker holding her own with the greatest minds, a potent symbol of the persistent struggle for women's education, public voice, intellectual recognition. Her story resonates deeply today. Inspiration for those challenging systemic barriers, recovering lost histories of influential women.
It's a testament to her enduring power, really, that she continues to be relevant. Her story reinterpreted through the lens of each new generation's struggles and aspirations. Hashtag outro. So what does this entire journey mean for us then, the audience of the AI history of Western philosophy, as we try to piece together these ancient lives and truly understand the foundations of Western thought?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Aspasia of Miletus emerges not as some mere consort or footnote, but as a philosopher in her own right, with a discernible, remarkably coherent intellectual project. Her ideas on ethical rhetoric, cultivating virtue in the household, the pedagogical power of desire, they suggest a systematic thinker, one whose influence was arguably foundational for the Socratic tradition. I mean, the compelling claim she taught Pericles oratory, developed a dialectical method Socrates adopted, articulated the philosophical framework of love later given to dichotomy, all point toward an intellect of the first order. A central figure whose absence from the traditional canon is a profound loss.
Her unique position, that foreign woman in Athens, seems to have been the key. It gave her the freedom to transcend the oikos constraints, engage directly with the city's intellectual life. Her philosophy, connecting personal to political, domestic to public good, truly reflects that outsider perspective. Allowed her a breadth of vision, a practical wisdom largely unavailable to others then. She leveraged her marginal status into a unique strength.
Ultimately, the Aspasian enigma isn't really about the impossibility of knowing the past. It's about the choices we make interpreting its fragmented record. For far too long, historical tradition chose to amplify her detractors, perpetuating a sexualized caricature while minimizing the consistent testimony to her intellectual prowess from the very philosophers we revere. Replacing Aspasia in the philosophical canon is more than just academic exercise. It's an act of historical recovery, methodological correction. Requires us to question the patriarchal assumptions shaping our intellectual inheritance. Recognize that the genesis of Western thought was far more diverse, dynamic, contested than traditional narratives allowed us to believe.
Aspasia of Miletus remains a powerful symbol, intellectual womanhood, a testament to the persistent struggle to write a more inclusive, accurate history of philosophy. Her recovery isn't just an addendum to the story, it's a necessary revision of its opening chapter, inviting us to look beyond established narratives, discover the rich, untold stories beneath. So consider this provocative thought for your own exploration. If one of the most celebrated philosophical methods and profound theories of love and Western thought potentially originated with a woman whose legacy was intentionally obscured, whose voice was muted, what other foundational figures might we be overlooking? And what does that say about the history we've inherited, not just in philosophy, but in every field? What new possibilities for thought emerge when we truly embrace a more inclusive understanding of the origins of knowledge itself? Thank you for joining us on this journey through the AI history of Western philosophy. We encourage you to seek out the original sources, continue your own exploration. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep thinking.